think we can start now, yeah?
Yep, we can start now. Thank you.
Yeah. Today, we are going to have a session on panel 5 with everyday memory and resistance. The speakers will be José Costa. We'll talk about the experience of clandestine organizing in Dili after the Santa Cruz Massacre. José Costa is, I think, one of the protagonists, clandestine protagonists that who also organized a secret voyage to Australia in 1995. And also, I think he's also as a film and stage actor. People can see his face on in film Guerra de Beatriz, Balibo 5, and Sumatra. I think that's Jera Costa. And the second speaker, I think we all know Michael Leach. Michael Leach is professor in political and international relations in Department of Social Science of Swinburne University, and also I think one of the founder of Timor-Leste Studies Association. And the third panelist is Leah Ken. Leah Ken Leah Ken is a senior fellow in School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. I think Leah has been engaged in long-term empirical research in Timor-Leste since 2000 and has a lot of involvement in other activities as well in Timor-Leste. So I think I'll give floor to José Costa to start the presentation.
Thank you very much to TNSI for accepting my abstract. So my presentations tonight with the title of Clandestine Organizing in Dili after the Santa Cruz Massacre. My presentations outline some of the process in which young East Timorese became opposed to the Indonesian army and involved in the struggle to free East Timor from Indonesian occupations. This paper is based on my memoir, A Work in Progress, based on first-hand experience. I will discuss how everyday life form our way of thinking and decisions to act in occupied East Timor. It also look at the creation of youth clandestine cells in which I participate, and the strategy we used to keep the struggle alive after the Dili massacre, when many of youth clandestine leaders were captured and sent to jail. So in 1975, when Indonesian army invaded, many of the East Timorese youth who later took part in the Santa Cruz demonstration were still very young, and some of us were born under the Indonesian occupation. Many of us had lost our family members since the beginning of the Indonesian takeover. I was born in 1976 when my family were on the run to escape when the Indonesians reached our hometown in Baucau. We lived in the jungle for roughly about 3 years. My first memory as a little boy was witnessing my parents and my siblings burying my grandmother in the middle of the jungle. She had died from exhaustion and sickness. My family was captured in 1979 by the Indonesian army, who then transported us to Baucau. We were forced to live with my father's sister, who could barely support us all. Indonesia would not allow us to live in my father's village of Nambu, as it was out of bounds, being near Baucau Airport. We moved to my mother's village, Buasari. In 1984, my father was killed, found dead, tied to a tree while on his nightly guard duty. The Indonesian army was targeting one of my great uncle from my mother's side. So the army framed him as having killed my father. By doing that, they drove a wedge between our two families to weaken this family network. Because of this crisis, we had to move back to my father's village in Nambu. But the Indonesian army once again forced us to move close to the main roads. The land was infertile and full of rocks. Added to the death of my father, this was another hardship in our everyday life. In 1995, the Indonesian army set up an organization called Karang Taruna to create activities for the young East Timorese and also to appeal to East Timorese youth to work with the Indonesian army to have a sense of discipline and to be good Indonesian citizens. The army also punished some of our family members who did not want to work without any pay to build roads and to other activities imposed by the Indonesian army. I and my cousins got angry and threw rocks at the Indonesian army post in our village. As a result, we had to run away and hid in our relatives' houses. We were afraid that army might kill us or turn us into TBO, soldiers' slave. These cousins of mine became some of the youngest men to join the volunteer fighters in the jungle in the 1990s. In my case, in 1997, as an 11 years old boy, I left Baucau to come to Dili. When I arrived, I met several young people who had also come from other districts across East Timor, such as Aileu, Bobonaru, Los Palos, and Viqueque. I struggled at first because I did not know anyone. The only hope that I had was rely on those new friends for help. The next day, I completely by chance, I ran into one of my auntie, and she took me to a distant relative who she stayed with in Kamea in Eastern Dili. 2 months later, I moved to Bidau Lesidere with my uncle and aunt. There I met new groups of young people. We started our nucleus or cells, and often we encourage each other to throw rocks at Indonesian army patrol cars at night. There I met some youth clandestine leaders, such as Donaciano Gomez, Pedro Clamarfuig, and Didi Boavida, who was also known as Didi Formosa. My uncle and aunt returned to Baucau, so I had to be self-reliant. I moved to Bairro Formosa to work full-time full-time in a Chinese run shop. I met more nucleus groups in other suburbs, such as Bidau Tahularan, Marconi, and Campo Alor, Audian, and Kuluhun. The shop I work at became one of the places for the youth who knew and trusted me to ask for malaria tablets, betadines, and other basic needs for clandestine work. We also pass on information to other young people about demonstrations and looked out for and distracted soldiers and spies during clandestine political meetings. In my first 4 years in Dili, before the Santa Cruz massacres, there were 4 demonstrations. In 1989 at Tasitolu, during the visit of John Paul II, in Lesidere, at an event marking the 50th anniversary of the Dili Catholic Diocese, at São Paulo's High School, and finally at Hotel Turismo, where US diplomat John Monjo was staying. As a result of these demonstrations, many of the youths involved were arrested and some killed by the army, including Didi Formosa, who disappeared after the Paulus protest. And I don't think his family ever found his remains. This nucleus group had organized well before the Santa Cruz, before Dili massacre, and were ready to act to hold a mass demonstration if the Portuguese parliamentarians had visited. I was 15 years old in 1991, like many others. I joined the crowd that was marching from Motayel Church and carrying flowers and banners with political slogans to the cemetery. There I met my friends Florentino, Alfredo de Arainado, Paulino, and other youths from Bidau Lesidere and Bidau Tahularan. There were many youths at the march, so it lifted the courage up high. And before I joined the crowd, some of the youths already stabbed one of the Indonesian soldiers at the Kantor Gubernur, now the government palace. So it gave the young people in the crowd more courage. But I warned my friend Paulino, who was next to me, that we must be careful because the army who shot us. Sadly, Paulino survived, but he was deliberately killed by an Indonesian army truck in Bairopite in 1993. As the crowd arrived at the Santa Cruz Cemetery, prayers and shout of freedom could be heard. Suddenly, the chaos started. After the first round of gunshot, we all ran to safety as much as we could. I jumped the fence and ran as fast as I could. But 3 days later, I was captured during the police roundup operations. They brought me to the Kumoro police headquarters.
You have 5 minutes more.
Okay. So when I was at the police headquarters, I was barely beaten. So my next biggest worry was I was losing my job because I was disappeared for 2 weeks. But when I was released, my boss found out that I was supporting the independent supporter. So I had to apply, very hard bold to retain my job. And I told him that if you fire me, my friends could come and burn down the shop. So it was, those days you have to play, very hard things to stay alive. So I think I will skip some of the reading here. So after the Dili massacre, the group, our group, we had to keep the struggle alive. So we also create our own intelligence network, if you like. So when the Indonesian army deployed their soldiers to the suburbs in Dili, we have to avoid the army battalions. So we started to change our strategy, and we started targeting the children of the Indonesian intels and then Indonesians out of duties. So we started to target them, to keep them, to distract them. That even though you send our leaders to jails, but we still here to fight you, and our struggle is still alive. So in 1993, and we start to discover that the Indonesian government also sent a lot of young Timoris to Indonesia, like Java and other part of Indonesia, for what they call job creation training. So when they come back from Indonesia, those young people, when they come back to East Timor, they received, boats for fishing. So we're trying to create a sense of that we have to make them, to distrust one another, because that's one of our strategy. So we took one of the boats that's supplied by the Indonesian fishery department, and we sailed to Australia in 1995. So it was 18 of us who actually bought on the boat to come to Australia as one of the strategy in the diplomat front. Okay. So yeah, I'm almost finished. So this is the boat. This is a similar boat that we took, and then this guy in the middle is the owner of the boat. So we managed to bring him with us to Australia. So this one here, it's one of my primary school friends who transported all the logistics to the boat for us to sail to Australia. So I'll come to the conclusion now. So I would say that The Santa Cruz Massacre is one of the most talked about events in the history of Timor-Leste. But it is only many confrontations in the rural and in Dili. So this is only massacre that we talk about, but we tend to forget, a lot of confrontation that actually took place in East Timor. So I hand back to you, Nuno. Thank you very much.
Thank you, José. I think it's very strong presentation. I can say that it's like a narrative, a strong narrative presentation from first-hand account. The second speaker, the second panelist is Michael Leach. We'll talk about Santa Cruz and clandestine strategy. So, Michael, the time is yours.
Thank you, Nuno. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yes, thank you for a marvelous paper, José, and I'm very pleased to be following on from that. This paper is called If Not Us, Then Who? Santa Cruz and Clandestine Strategy. And it is based largely, I should say at the outset, on some interviews I did in 2010 with Gregorio Saldana, José Neves, but primarily with Elizario Ferreira, who was one of the leadership group of FETUN. And it's not something that we have time to discuss in this paper, but I think it's very interesting, the question of the overlapping memberships of many of these groups in clandestine groups in occupied East Timor, which is a topic that I would like to ask some Timorese about at another time to learn more about it. So, but I want to talk about the lead up to Santa Cruz and some clandestine strategy after Santa Cruz, which José also touched on how difficult things were. So there were agitprop wings of the clandestine movements that were involved in coordinating civil disobedience campaigns, for example, disrupting Indonesian elections. And they sought to counter the Indonesian military strategy of setting East Timorese groups against one another. That was, of course, the Indonesian intelligence strategy all through the occupation, right up to the end. And FETUN leader Elizario Ferreira explained to me with the following quote: the Indonesians were implementing a dual strategy. One of the Indonesian policies was, and I don't speak Indonesian, ila kawin sila, interracial marriage. This was seen as a policy of Islamization. The Indonesians sent women over to marry Timorese men, or would encourage young men or women to become Muslim, to set up a situation where Muslims would fight Christians. The other Indonesian policy of divide and conquer was to divide the youth into different groups so that they could be pitted against each other. SGI sought to use the youth and were very dangerous at this time. This was a deliberate strategy of destabilization. Now, this gets into some tricky issues, but in response, the clandestine groups developed their own counter strategies, which also had a dual character. Firstly, to promote unity among East Timorese youth and to undermine these Indonesian intelligence activities. We had to continue to agitate, inform, support the youth so they wouldn't turn against each other. They also sought to disrupt the Indonesian administration and sow confusion. One of the most critical events in occupation history was in part a product of this counter strategy. As Ferreira says, every day we would make pamphlets, we would make things up. For example, the pamphlet we made, which eventually led to the events of November 12, 1991. So you have this tension between the secularism, formal secularism of the clandestines and of the resistance generally, and also a mobilization policy. So while working closely with the church through the escuteiros, the scout movement, some clandestine groups sought to promote secular nationalism to maximize membership. So, for example, Ojektil changed its name to Ojetil in 1991, which saw the word Catholic removed from the group's name, a formal secularist position. This was supported by instructions from Shenanigans Mahunu, and although some students continue to use Ojektil. Despite this formal secularism, I want to argue that clandestine strategy also used popular affiliations to the Catholic Church, which had grown over the occupation, to maximise popular mobilisation and to destabilise the Indonesian administration. And indeed, the prelude to Santa Cruz is one example in part of this. So, of course, at Motel, we saw on the 28th of October 1991 the death of Sebastião Gomes. And Naldo Ray's memoir highlights that the Indonesian troops also desecrated the church on that day, heightening religious aspects of the tensions. And Ray noted that those shrines and statues had been defaced in the past. This was the first major attack on a church since the invasion. And to him, the significance of this disrespect was profound for the protesters, who saw it as a further assault on our values, spirituality, identity, and culture. We felt our last refuge, our peaceful churches, had been sucked into the horror. And of course, then we saw the cancellation of the Portuguese parliamentary delegation, which inflamed tensions between independence activists and Indonesian authorities. I think sometimes this has been pushed aside, some of the strategic aspects of the discourse here, as part of a wider strategy to maximise disorder. Ojatil and Fetun and other activists spread the word that an attack on nuns and convents was imminent. As Gregorio Saldana put it, sometimes we had to make false propaganda to achieve our objectives. A pamphlet was circulated which proved influential in mobilising youth. Ferreira recalls, we asked all young East Timorese to provide security for the churches, convents and priest houses, because the Indonesian military is planning to attack the priests and attack and rape nuns. When we spread this word, many people went to provide security to the church in October. This created a feeling of heightened tensions. Then on the 28th, Sebastião was killed in Motael, and Sebastião's death led to the events of 12 November. That was the pamphlet we set out. We were reacting to the policy of Islamization as they saw it. Ferreira comments generally on Santa Cruz. So when Sebastião was killed, we all got together and got ourselves organised. The organisations that gathered were Ojatil, Sagrada Familia, Fetun, Renatil. Those were the main promoters. We chose Giri, Gregorio Saldana, as the coordinator because he had political experience and he was from the Externat. And Ojatil was established before Fetun. It came out of the Externat. Now, Ferreira was present when a group went to discuss the protest, which included a mass, of course, with Bishop Bello. And this is a fascinating, to me, story. One story was from the prelude to Santa Cruz, demonstrates the close relationship between the church and the clandestine groups. So on the night of 9 November, several members of clandestine groups went to talk to Bishop Bello. Joana Diaz was there, Lurai Tassi, Eli Cuatro, and Belisario Ferreira. We went to see the bishop to ask if he would say the Mass at Motael. We asked him if he would say the Mass, and he was taken aback. How many people do you plan to bring to this Mass? We told him thousands, because we included Sagrada Familia, Fetun, Renatil, Ojatil. We told him we planned a Mass at Motael, and then from Motael walk along the road, praying and singing all the way to Santa Cruz. Once we had laid flowers at the grave, we would make a demonstration at Santa Cruz. The bishop was very surprised and began pacing around the yard with his rosary, thinking. He then asked 3 questions of the young visitors, which still resonated with those present, according to Elizario Ferreira, years later. And these are the 3 questions, and I find these really fascinating. Bishop Bello asked them, if Timor becomes independent, if you lose your hands or your feet, if you are not able to govern, if the well-educated children of those who support integration rule over you, how will you feel? We replied, Father, we want Timor to be independent. So then he asked, what if you are disabled and nobody will employ you, rule over you and don't acknowledge you? We replied that we would accept that. Finally, he asked, what about those who are now overseas? Their children have gone to good schools. Those who today support the Indonesians, who don't want to participate in the struggle. What if they come and rule over you and don't look after your families after you are dead? We told him that we were prepared to live with the consequences. These were the 3 questions from Bishop Bello. Bishop Bello then told them to ask Motael priest Father Ricardo to do the Mass, who, of course, as everyone would know, accepted, offering to do it himself if Ricardo refused. Despite these reservations, Father Ricardo agreed, since there are so many of you, I am ready to die for you. So several clandestine organisations travelled out to the districts on the 11th to encourage young people to come to Dili for the protest. Ferreira was among them, travelling up to his home district of Emera. The plan involved a coordinated strategy for attendance, and all the clandestine groups had agreed on this. People had to carry rosaries and wear 3 shirts. Lorico Aswain, Lorikeet Warriors shirt for the procession, under a proper shirt for mass. Then, just in case they had to run away or there were problems in Santa Cruz, to have another neutral T-shirt to run away and hide with. The information was passed on by word of mouth. At the time, there was something we called politica corrente, running politics. All we had to do was say something today, and tomorrow all of Timor knew. Now, you can see in Max Stahl's footage, you can see youth changing shirts as they flee. You can see at a couple of occasions, people are changing their shirts as they flee from the cemetery. Ferreira himself would never make it to Santa Cruz. He was arrested in Emera on the 11th and held until the 28th and refused permission to return to Dili, and he was sent to his home suku of Atara. As we all know, some 3,500 East Timorese students and youth attended the protest. The plan, as CNRM Clandestine Secretary Constancio Pinto recalls, was to demand a referendum on East Timor, dialogue between Indonesia and the East Timorese resistance, and church leaders. Gregorio Saldana was shot in the hip during the protest and later received a life sentence. As Naldo Ray recounts, many clandestines were captured and killed in the days following. Others were forced into hiding or, like Constancio Pinto, into leaving the territory. As José was saying before, in the wake of Santa Cruz, clandestine operations became very difficult, with mass arrests of activists inside the territory and in Indonesia. As Ferreira said, after the demonstration, the leadership of the resistance organisations broke down and the Indonesians had the upper hand again in Timor. Many people were taken away, many put in jail, people were afraid. On the other hand, as Igas Alves was noting last night, world engagement with East Timor increased dramatically after Max Stahl's footage made international headlines. And Mount Igas was saying last night that people were listening to Radio Netherlands and very quickly realised the impact of this protest was having internationally. Other actions included the 1994 Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference protests, which embarrassed the Indonesian government at home, and clandestines had increasing contact with Western journalists throughout the 1990s after Santa Cruz, one of the impacts of Santa Cruz. Later strategy, by 1995, the East Timorese diaspora would claim that youth were now leading the struggle. That same year, Indonesian military commander Ruhiatna would complain that rather than Valentil, it's the clandestines that have to be watched. They're everywhere in Dili. This coincided with weakening Cold War ties, of course, around 1991, that had sustained international support for the Suharto regime. And the long years of resistance and international solidarity began to bear fruit. One campaign that Fatun was involved with after Santa Cruz was the Youth Cross campaign. Fatun was formally banned in 1992, and I wrote an article for the TLSA proceedings in 2011, for the 2011 conference, about this if you're interested, a preliminary history of Fatun. And a new focus became the Easter Youth Cross campaign, which was a church cover for the continuing political education of youth. So under the banner of the church, it was easier to organise even after the crackdown, because it was tolerated by authorities. Processions took the cross from one parish to another in Timor, and masses would be followed by political seminars and demonstrations. As the 1990s progressed, the increasing importance of the clandestines became obvious as part of the overall resistance strategy, and saw political education conducted by the armed resistance at Suko level, politicising people in preparation for independence. Fatun itself had direct relationships with Shanana, direct relationships with Valentil, until the CNRT was established in 1998. In the lead up to the 1999 referendum, like other clandestine groups, Fatun was placed under the presidium of the Youth Lorikeet Warriors, which coordinated activities with CNRT throughout 1999. The failure of integration, I think, is what is most profoundly illustrated by the clandestines. As Adejandro notes, Renatil in particular had a large membership of students whose family had not supported Frontline in the 1970s. One study he noted found that 48%, nearly half of Renatil members had an Apadete background, and a quarter UDT and a quarter Fretland. Now, whether or not these figures are accurate, I think it demonstrates the way nationalism, the clandestine movement, had been reframed profoundly by this generation from 1970s polarities towards a position of national unity. And indeed, Renatil's constitution explicitly noted that it was open to all nationalist and patriotic East Timorese students everywhere and not affiliated with any East Timorese political party, though each member may choose one of the political parties without representing the organisation as a whole. The rise of the clandestines amply demonstrated the failure of the Indonesian project of winning the hearts and minds of a younger, educated urban elite. Now, particularly...
5 minutes ago.
Thank you, Nuno. I'm nearly done. Particularly with Renatil cadre, they were highly educated, favoured by the Indonesians educationally, taken into the Indonesian system in Indonesian universities in Bali and in Java. And of course, the Indonesians put great stock in the prospects of this younger Indonesian-speaking urban elite being integrationist. And so the policies of taking these scholastic elites outside East Timor were designed to accelerate, as Dos Santos put it, the assimilation between East Timorese and Indonesians. But these measures had a counter effect in practice. Over time, the spread of literacy and education would have its own national integrative role, but not as Indonesia intended. And the failure to convert younger East Timorese would prove a decisive blow to integrationist ambitions, as the education system failed to create the Indonesian apolitical system the new order state so desired, as Angie Bexley puts it. The Juventude's knowledge of Indonesian language, institution and emerging opposition figures also produced a far more effective resistance structure. And I remember José Neves telling me that Renatil controlled Impetu, which was the formal student union of Timorese students recognised by the Indonesians. They completely controlled that organisation, for example. As my final slide, in concert with the other wings of the resistance, the clandestines fostered an alternative community for the expression of national identity among East Timorese youth of that generation. As Gregorio Saldana recalls, the clandestine phrase, "If not now, when? If not us, then who?" captured the determination to mobilise a national consciousness among the Juventude, whose rejection of Indonesia's occupation stung harder than the resistance of the older generation, striking at the heart of the project of forced integration. Obrigado, Wayne. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think we learned a lot from your presentation. The next panelist will be Leah Ken, Santa Cruz Memory, the State and Restless Dead. Leah, Manalia, you can start now.
Obrigada, Mal. Thank you, Mal Nuno and Bunuiti. Thank you also to the organisers. It's really a privilege to be a part of this important event marking 30 years since the Santa Cruz Massacre. And I'm also honoured to share a panel with Mike and Mal José. Mal José particularly, it was really inspiring and moving to hear about your first-hand experiences in both the lead up to and also the aftermath of the Santa Cruz Massacre. So I'm going to ask you all now to shift gears, because we're going to jump forwards in time from the massacre itself to think about some of the diverse and dynamic ways in which it has been remembered. So in this paper, I'm going to trace how, since Timor-Leste's national independence, the memory of Santa Cruz increasingly works not only to imagine a national community, but also to align with the interests of the state in crafting ideal, forward-looking and patriotic youth citizens and building diplomatic relations with Indonesia. At the same time, I argue that while the bodies of those who died in the massacre remain missing, the memory of Santa Cruz will never fully align with the state's interests. And this is because the restless spirits of the dead continue to prompt families and survivors to search for their bodies and demand the Indonesian military reveal the sites where they were dumped or destroyed, drawing attention to unresolved legacies. And this paper is part of a broader project that considers the diverse forms of memory work taking place in Timor-Leste in relation to the Indonesian occupation, and it's involved several periods of fieldwork between 2016 and 2019. So I want to briefly chart the trajectory of public commemorations of the Santa Cruz Massacre. to show how both the spaces of memory and the meanings associated with the massacre have shifted over time. And then I then want to talk in the second half of the paper about some of the everyday spaces and work of memory of families and survivors, which complicate this story. So as we have already heard from Mount Airgus yesterday and also from Mike, Max Stahl's footage of the Santa Cruz massacre had a powerful impact beyond East Timor's borders. As it was broadcast internationally, Santa Cruz was transformed into what memory studies scholars refer to as a travelling memory that circulated through multiple media across space and time. Much as footage of other civic massacres, including Tiananmen Square in China and Sharpeville in South Africa, the Santa Cruz footage shocked and engaged audiences in new ways and prompted a profound change in perspective. And from that point on, it became increasingly difficult for Western states simply to ignore the violence being committed by the Indonesian military. As well, massive demonstrations around the world and galvanized a new era of international solidarity. The massacre was also commemorated in Portugal and elsewhere, and these commemorations contrasted with the hostile environment within East Timor, where the massacre could not be publicly remembered for much of the rest of the 1990s. I can talk a little bit about this in the question time. During the period of the 1990s, I would suggest that Santa Cruz was remembered as an archetypal story of youth resistance and heroism. It came to be, as Fiona Crockford puts it, synonymous with the struggle of self-determination, inscribed into memory both nationally and internationally as a revolutionary moment in which youth appeared as heroic protagonists. Since Timor-Leste gained its national independence, the memory of Santa Cruz has undergone further transformation, I would argue. Firstly, an important geographic shift has taken place, as the locus of public commemorations has shifted from the diaspora to Timor-Leste itself. Second, the size of the commemorations has grown markedly from a small event involving a handful of survivors and families to a large event now involving thousands of participants annually. Many are young people who organise their own parallel events, including seminars, concerts, and sports competitions. Third, and relatedly, the annual commemorations are increasingly endorsed by the state. Indeed, the Government Secretary of State for Youth and Sport now has responsibility for organising the commemorations and provides substantial funding for them. And as many of you will also know, the government has approved $8 million to build a new memorial at the Santa Cruz Cemetery. I would argue that there's been a fourth related transformation in the meanings attached to Santa Cruz since independence. While initially remembered as an archetypal moment of terror and youth resistance that galvanised pro-independence activism, Santa Cruz has now become a foundational narrative for the emergence of the independent state. It has come to symbolise the key turning point in the struggle, the moment when the mass slaughter of youth finally woke up the outside world to the suffering of the East Timorese people, leading inexorably to national independence. And these understandings are reinforced, I would suggest, by the embodied experience of participating in the commemorations, which links physical space with understandings of what is known to have happened there, and makes a temporal link between the sacrifices of the past and the achievement of independent statehood. Importantly, I think these transformations have not been inevitable, and they are in large part due to the sustained efforts of prominent survivors of the Santa Cruz demonstration to keep the memory of the massacre alive and advocate for greater recognition by the state to the contributions made by the youth clandestine. So many of these survivors, as we know, are now members of the 12th of November Committee, and they occupy a unique position as those who narrowly escaped death themselves. Referring to themselves as mata restu, the Tetum term for survivor, which literally means leftovers from the dead, they are imbued with a special form of power and moral legitimacy, a power to retell the story of Santa Cruz, impart its lessons, and act in the name of the dead. All of this renders their voice difficult to ignore by the political elite. Yet I want to argue that as the commemorations have grown large and have been increasingly endorsed by the state, the memory of Santa Cruz increasingly works in the service of the state. Those who took part in the Santa Cruz protests have been redefined from symbols of youth resistance to symbols of patriotic duty and selflessness, a transformation that supports the ideal, the state-building goal of crafting ideal, forward-looking youth citizens. And as Amy Rothschild has argued, and I won't go into this here, the construction of those who participated in the protest as martyrs rather than victims of human rights violations also serves the state-building project of building diplomatic relations with Indonesia by dampening calls for retributive justice. And some of these transformations, I think, can be seen in the ways in which the massacre is frequently invoked around the time of the annual commemorations, through radio and television talk shows and through seminars, as a means of imparting lessons to the youth of today. Santa Cruz has become the symbolic vehicle through which the youth of today are reminded of their easy lives, their freedom and their opportunities, which contrast with the hardship, suffering and sacrifices of the youth of the past. The youth of today are instructed to learn from and uphold the values of their predecessors by studying hard, displaying leadership, discipline and unity, and contributing to national development. Now, I don't want to suggest that these lessons are not valuable in many ways. Yet I would argue that the pedagogical lesson provided by Santa Cruz also contains a disciplinary power that has the potential to delegitimize the youth activism of the present and divert attention away from the structural problems that restrict young people's opportunities. So just to give you an example, there have been a couple of times in the last 10 years when student and youth activists have attempted to mark Santa Cruz by protesting about contemporary issues such as government corruption, and this has been deemed inappropriate and disrespectful to the memory of Santa Cruz. Now, despite these transformations, my argument in this paper is that as long as the bodies of those who died in the massacre remain missing, the memory of Santa Cruz will never fully align with the state's interests. But before turning to this argument, let me first briefly outline some of the efforts to exhume the dead that have taken place in relation to the Santa Cruz victims and their limitations. And I guess a key point to make, firstly, is that in contrast to the energy and resources that goes into the annual commemorations, little attention has been directed into searching for the bodies of those who were killed. The exact number of the dead, of course, remains unknown. The fact that the Indonesian military successfully covered many of its evidentiary traces, including, it is presumed, by burning bodies or dumping them at sea, has complicated attempts to come up with a precise figure. A further complication is that Santa Cruz was not a single event, but as we know, a continuum of events that took place in the days and weeks after the massacre itself. So 30 years on from the massacre, only a handful of bodies have been located and recovered. According to the 12th of November committee, as of 2019, the bodies of 17 victims had been recovered and identified, while 68 are still listed as missing. Other estimates regarding the missing, including those of the Commission for Truth, Perception and Reconciliation, are much higher, yet arguably are less up to date than the 12th of November committee figures. The difficulties of locating sites, the significant costs involved in exhumations, and the reluctance of political leaders to destabilise diplomatic relations with Indonesia are some of the reasons why the state has not prioritised the search for the dead. Yet it's important to acknowledge too that the international community has likewise given limited attention to this issue. For instance, the Santa Cruz massacre was not one of the 10 priority cases of the Serious Crimes Investigations Unit established by the UN during the period of Untitled. But even if it had been, exhumations were not a key focus of the unit's work, but rather were treated as instrumental to meeting the broader goal of prosecutions. In other words, the dead were regarded by the Serious Crimes Unit as criminal evidence, a stepping stone to the desired prosecution and conviction of war criminals. And this meant that limited attention was given to families' needs to recover and rebury the dead. The Serious Crimes Unit did eventually organise a limited investigation into Santa Cruz in 2001, when an exploratory dig took place at a site near T-Bar, close to Dili. Yet only 2 staff were assigned to the dig, and after it failed to locate any human remains, no attempt was made to take the investigations further. It was not until several years later that a dedicated search for the bodies of the Santa Cruz dead took place. And as many of you will know, in 2008, Soren Blau from the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine in Australia initiated an investigation in collaboration with Luis Fondebrider of the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team. And this investigation came to be known as the International Forensic Team, or the IFT. Now, the IFT took a very different approach to exhumations from that of the Serious Crimes Unit. And this approach can be understood as part of a rapidly evolving field of what's known as forensic humanitarian action that involves the exhumation of mass graves in order to identify the dead and return the remains to their families. It is an approach that de-links exhumations from prosecutions, allowing for new possibilities to emerge for the building of relationships with families and responding to their needs. The IFT was established after several years of consultation with the East Timorese government, which eventually led to the signing of an MOU. The Victorian Institute then submitted a funding proposal to the Australian government's aid program, then known as AusAid, to fund the team's activities. And acutely aware of the sensitivities surrounding this issue, the team was cautious as to how they framed their activities. As Soren Blau explains, and I quote, "We never spoke about prosecutions with the East Timorese government, only about emotional healing," end quote. The AusAid funding proposal was similarly framed carefully around the need for training and awareness raising on forensic investigations rather than around investigations themselves. And as some of you will know, and these details are documented in the excellent documentary Anatomy of a Massacre, which you should all watch if you've not seen it yet, the IFT achieved only modest success. While it began by investigating reports buried in large unmarked graves in T-Bar, it found no evidence of graves of human remains after several weeks of digging. The investigations then moved on to another site at Hera, a small cemetery where there was a row of unmarked graves where stones had been placed. These investigations revealed about 20 graves in the cemetery, and the remains of 16 bodies found in these graves were identified as Santa Cruz victims. The IFT investigations were not, however, continued when the AusAid money ran out. And the East Timorese government also made it clear they had no interest in pursuing them further. Those involved in the IFT also came to believe that any further investigations would be futile unless they had the cooperation of the Indonesian government and military. So since the winding up of the IFT, it is surviving relatives and the prominent Mata Restu involved in the 12th of November committee who keep alive the demand for the recovery of bodies and engage in their own locally grounded efforts to search for, identify and rebury them. And in a marked divergence from the epistemological assumptions that underpin the Serious Crimes Unit and the IFT, which regarded the dead as passive and inert substances, these local demands and practices are informed by embodied experiences of the dead as active agents who continue to experience the lives of the living and remind them of unfulfilled obligations. The spirits of the dead deliver messages to their surviving relatives and their close friends through dreams, visions, and bodily afflictions such as illnesses. And these messages seem to reveal that while the dead are happy to be remembered symbolically through the annual commemorations, they deem this insufficient and will remain restless and unhappy until their corpses are recovered and they are properly settled through reburial into the realm of the ancestors. And these messages continue to prompt families to search for the dead, which in some cases have led them to the sites where bodies lie. So in one case to me, described by Gregorio Saldana, the body of a young man from Bacau who participated in the Santa Cruz demonstration was located by his family in 2019. He had been captured by the Indonesian military on the 12th of November 1991 and taken to Natabora in Manatuto district, where he subsequently died. After family members had been repeatedly visited by the young man's spirit in their dreams, they requested the assistance of local veterans in Natabora and a spiritual guide to help identify the location of his body and recover and rebury his remains. Gregorio, who was present at the exhumation, describes how the spiritual guide, or Matandok, located the site of the body by throwing a chicken egg into the bush. The site where it landed was the site where the digging took place, resulting in the recovery of a small number of bones. These bones were carefully wrapped in ties before being transferred to the ossuary in the National Garden of Hero Cemetery to await reburial. I would argue that the spirits of the dead also ensure that responding to their demands remains a central component of the work of the 12th of November Committee. Gregorio, for example, describes being motivated by a powerful dream he had while in prison in Indonesia in 1993, in which he was given a key covered with a red cloth. Gregorio has interpreted the broad parameters of this dream as a message from the dead that he has been entrusted with the weighty responsibility of continuing to search for the bodies of the Santa Cruz victims. His dream gestures towards the unique moral responsibility that inheres in the identity of the Mate Restu. And indeed, I would argue that it is in the modest space of the office of the 12th of November Committee, which, as many of you know, is so different from the large, crowded space of the commemorations, that some of the most important memory work around the Santa Cruz Massacre can be found. It is here that the committee maintains a list of the numbers of the dead, missing, and survivors of the massacre. It also gathers information about the whereabouts of the dead by seeking eyewitnesses and following up leads, keeping this information in store until such time as future exhumations might be possible. Families of the dead and missing are a regular embodied presence in the office, seeking advice and support from the 12th of November Committee and providing their own information and leads. These activities reveal that there remains some friction between the interests of the 12th November Committee and that of the state. Although the committee remains courteous and diplomatic in its relations with the government and remains heavily invested in imparting the nationalistic messages and lessons of Santa Cruz to today's youth, it also produces statements. It also produces statements and media releases calling on the government to demand that the Indonesian military explain and identify the places where the bodies of victims were dumped, thrown into the sea, or buried. So as Gregorio explains, those who died at Santa Cruz were killed as part of an orchestrated mass plan carried out by the Indonesian military. The military must therefore know where their remains lie. And he is acutely conscious that the military actors responsible for transporting, disposing, and dumping these bodies will not live much longer, and that this information may soon be lost. So to conclude, in this paper, I've argued that the memory of Santa Cruz increasingly works in the interests of the state, as the bodies of the martyred youth of Santa Cruz have become the symbolic vehicles through which the youth of today are instructed on the values of unity and sacrifice. Yet the spirits of the dead, by reminding their families and the Mate Restu of unfulfilled obligations, I think continue to prevent the memory of Santa Cruz from being fully aligned with the state's interests. And finally, I would argue then that to gain a fuller picture of how Santa Cruz is remembered today and whose interests this serves, it's necessary to look beyond the large nationalistic commemorations to the everyday work of searching for and caring for the dead and the diverse spaces in which this takes place. The sense of urgency that imbues these practices also serves as a reminder that this issue needs our continued attention and support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mana. Very great presentation from 3 panelists. I hope now we are having 30 minutes, if I'm not wrong, to have a question and comments. So I am trying to see who is going to start. Any questions or comment?
Sure. I'm not sure whether Leah would know about this or anyone else in the session. I'm just interested in the recent memorial which was inaugurated, I think it was in Ainaro, regarding the young woman who was killed on the 12th of November 1991. And I was curious that there was a monument to her that was inaugurated, and it was just to her, and it was quite a large monument. I'm sorry that I've forgotten the young lady's name. I think it was Araujo Cortereal, and I've forgotten her first name. But it was I was curious to see that in comparison to the monument of Amali and Levi outside of the Untitled Church, how it doesn't contain any panels or any explanation about what the monument is about. And I understand there is one about to be erected or being planned at the Santa Cruz Cemetery. And then we have this regional monument in Ainaro. And so I'm interested in some of the origins of how this monument came to be about in Ainaro, and the fact that it is commemorating the life of a young woman in particular in terms of the gender aspects of the massacre. If people can maybe comment a little bit about that, about the memorialisation aspect of it in line with what Leah's just been presenting to us. Thank you.
All right. And this may be a person, I don't know the details, but of some status related to the Larai family, potentially, with the Cortereal link.
Yeah, that's a great question, Vanessa. I'm sorry I don't know about that Ainaro memorial. Maybe Nuno knows something about it. Yeah, I really only know about the one in Dili, which outside the Untitled Church, which has been a little bit controversial because of the lack of consultation that took place around it. And members of the 12th November committee have always argued that it should be moved to the site of the cemetery because that's where the event actually took place rather than outside the church. I'm not quite sure where that debate is at now, but that's, yeah, interesting to know about the gender element. I wonder if Hannah Loney would know something, but oh, she is on the line. Yeah, sorry, I can't really help you on that one.
I am online, but I only know about this through Vanessa and through José. So I don't, maybe Nuno knows a little bit more about this because I'm really interested in it as well. Thanks for bringing it up, Vanessa.
Well, it was inaugurated, I think, 2 weeks ago in Ainaro, but I don't really know about who organizing that, but the presence of Gregory Saldaña and others, 12 November protesters, they were present. But I want to add something here that it's also in the front of Untitled Church. It's not only one monument. Actually, there are other monuments that just built. It's just only say that 12 November of 1991. So there are 2 monuments already in front of Untitled Church. But there was criticism against the other monument because of it. Gregory Saldaña mentioned that it's not appropriate to build another monument there because the first one is also face a lot of criticism.
Yes, there was also some controversy. I remember talking to the November 12th committee around that time that names weren't put on it. That was also part of the issue, and as Leah mentioned, the lack of consultation with the November 12th committee as well.
It was also a further issue actually that because those 2 young men are actually still alive, there was concern about, you shouldn't be building monuments to people who are still alive. So I remember that being another issue.
Could I ask José something?
Yes.
José, thank you very much for a lovely presentation. And since you were involved in those demonstrations, can I just ask you if is anything you know, what was being prepared for the Portuguese parliamentarians delegation? That is a couple of weeks before Santa Cruz. And I understand that resistance was preparing. So can you tell me briefly if you know anything or someone who might know about these preparations?
Yes, you know, in the clandestine organizations in Dili in those days, there are a lot of layers. You know, you have a top, middle, and lower ones. So, like people like myself is very much in the grassroots lower ones. So we very much like passing on information from one to another. So the Portuguese parliamentarian delegations was widely talked about in 1991, let's say about 6 months before, there was already a lot of talk about. And then the message were already travel around in the country from one nucleus group to another, and then individual pass on to each other. Like in my experience, for example, I was working in the shop, and every day, my friends will come and sit in the front of the shop, and then we will talk about it. And also we will talk about, one of the, very famous, journalists, Jill Jolliffe. Her name was come up, over and over again that, she's one of the very, intellectual and very influential, journalists, which is the Indonesian government hated. They don't like her because, her report is very much, hurting Indonesians' government's reputation in the international communities. So those discussions always come up all the time. And when the cancellations happened, everybody tend to be like, a lot of young people, we were upset. We were like, why these people don't come, what they're afraid of, they should have a responsibility, it was a lot of, mix of, debate and discussion, blaming, Portuguese, abandoned the Timor, why they didn't come, So it's a lot of discussion, went around. So when the killing of the Sebastian Gomez, it's more like, fire, more young people angry. And so Portuguese delegation was widely discussed amongst the groups, especially the group, the nucleus group in East Timor, particularly in Dili at that time.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.
Mana Marisa?
I didn't raise my hand, but I find it.
I don't see anyone raise their hand, so.
But I can comment that I really liked all the presentations, and it links very well with the next panel on commemoration. So we already started the discussion, which will go on panel 8. And I find it very relevant, all the key points that she mentioned. Also how the memorialization of the event is happening in the independence year. So versus other events, other massacres, as José mentioned, everyday resistance that went on in all the districts. And so I think it's a good question for all of us why is the Santa Cruz Massacre such an important event memorialized today in Timor?
After the Dili massacre, we also educated ourselves in terms of how deal with the Indonesians' political manipulations, Indonesians' medias, and also Indonesians' tactics, about, bringing other East Timorese youth, to fight against, pro-independence groups. So from 1993, it was very, very difficult a time for us. And we also have to deal with, groups like a Ninja, for example, because in 1993 to 1995, is pretty much every night, almost like we were attacked by the Ninja groups. The army trucks will drop off, group of pro-integration groups to every suburbs. So we had to, defend ourselves with, machetes and rocks and weapons. And I remember one night at, my friend Alfredo Arainado's place in Marconi in Fatuhada, we basically managed to arrest one of the pro-integration members, and we interrogated him, and then we found out that he came from Atsabe, and he was a part of the SGE, the Combined Intelligence units. So which is, they do a lot of torture and things like that, and also we also have to. They're dealing with media, which is Nuno's panel was talking about last night. And sometimes the media will report, oh, the GPK had been defeated, the development, that sort of things. They always bring up, things like GPK has disappeared, we have defeated them. So young people like us, we have to do something that we have to keep, fighting the Indonesian intel, especially the collaborators like Mauhu, and then also the bakso seller. One of my presentations was in the meatball seller, the bakso seller. They pretend to be, the bakso seller or meatball seller, but at the same time, they also intel, from Kodim, the district command, army headquarters. So we have to, especially they put themselves in the front of the Bisubelo's house in Bidau Lesidere in the Sota. You might know, one more bar, the Sanana's reading room. They always concentrate around there. So we sometimes, we pretend, we also have to pretend ourselves. We buy the bakso, but we also hear, walkie-talkie, and we can see, the pistol under the t-shirt. So we have to constantly, fight against them. But all these actions, it's never, oriented by the resistance leaders or clandestine leadership. It was like individual young pro-independence group who actually doing that sort of things. So my group, we pretty much do that sort of action in those days. Yeah.
Thank you, José. Looking forward to reading your memoirs and your book, where you tell all the stories. And I think there are many stories that, as researchers, we hear from people about everyday resistance. And you were mentioning Bishop's Bellow residency. And I once interviewed a woman in Ainaro that was talking about how she smuggled messages inside papayas and that were delivered to the bishop's house. And so I think there are many stories to be told like yours. And thanks for that.
Thank you, Mana. Thank you for the question.
Michael?
Yes, I've got a question for Leah. Leah, I certainly remember hanging out with Soren Blau between 2008 and 2011 and in Dili and keeping track of the progress. And there, as we know from the documentary, there were some bodies found. But she certainly complained of the lack of political support after a while and then financial support. To what do you attribute that kind of loss of focus on the recovery of the bodies in that project?
Well, I think from Soren's perspective, yes, there never really was much political buy-in from the Australian government who was funding it. They apparently were quite upset that their funding was being used for actual exhumations as opposed to just capacity building, so they didn't want to extend the project. Sorry, it's probably all going on the record, but never mind. The Indonesian and the East Timorese government, I think, just was not interested in destabilising relations with Indonesia. I mean, that's the sort of that's basically where it stood. And I think the other frustration that Soren mentioned too was that I think they realised after a while that they were only going to make limited progress unless really they had buy-in from the Indonesian side, because there was going to be just so difficult to actually locate these sites without that kind of knowledge. And so that was, I guess, another compounding factor. So yeah, it's a real shame in a way that they did wind up, and I don't see really any political commitment anywhere for pursuing that sort of thing in the future, in the near future. I shouldn't be so pessimistic.
I think there's a question from Mount Damien Grenfell.
Hi, yeah, look, I'll make it really quick. I think we're right on time. Thanks. The panel was amazing, and as Marissa said, it does go into the next session really well, so much so that all three papers had helped plug really significant gaps in my paper. So I was madly taking notes, so thank you. Leah, it's just a really quick question, and maybe it's something we can come back to and talk about another time, but like sometimes I worry as academics trained in the West that we take too seriously the state in some contexts, and I'm not saying that obviously I'm not saying the state's not important in these conversations, particularly around conversations around commemoration, and Mike's question just then speaks to that about, well, obviously as a site of resource and particularly resources and political mobilisation, then the state can play a very active role, in say the recovery of bodies and so forth. But I just wondered, so it's only an observation, but I just wondered whether that if you're giving too much coherence to the state's response in Timor to the question of sort of an appropriation of aspects of the Santa Cruz commemorations, and that another way of seeing the state in these circumstances would be to see it as uneven and ad hoc, opportunistic, contradictory, momentary, and so forth. And rather than seeing it, perhaps I just wondered whether you were giving it too much of a sense of unity, in a sense, or as a system of governance. And that actually one of the reasons why we're even talking about the Santa Cruz Massacre and processes of commemoration is exactly, in the context of Timor, is exactly because it's been driven outside of the state. And that's given it a longevity and a meaning and a resonance that may not have been possible had actually, an often a very wrought system of governance had there been more involvement there. So it's just an observation rather than anything else. Something I was thinking about as you were speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I don't think there's been any grand intentional plan for Santa Cruz to be co-opted in a particular way. But I guess it's just that it's interesting to see, the resources that are now associated with the commemoration and that they are being funded by state departments does seem to be taking it in a different kind of trajectory, at least in Dili. And I'm not saying that things, I know that, you know, it's commemorated all around the country now, which is something that is also interesting. And I know it's commemorated in very diverse ways in different parts of the country as well. So I guess my cop-out answer is to say there probably wasn't enough time to go into some of those nuances in the paper, but that's a really great thing to be thinking about further. And I would also say too that I guess I do have some hope I think the 12th November committee work around gathering data, keeping that database alive is really important, as is the work that the families and survivors are doing as well to, you know, gather and rebury the dead as much as they're able to. And I think, you know, I do think that plays an important role in sort of fulfilling people's needs. But I guess I'd argue too that, you know, we shouldn't forget sort of the bigger picture here, that the Indonesian military kind of was responsible for this, and that they're the ones with the knowledge of where the sites are. So I guess we can't overplay the resilience and capacity of local communities either to sort of, you know, fill the gaps where the state is not able to take over. So yeah, but let's talk about this another time. Thank you though for the question.
Thanks, Claire.
We'll have 5 minutes discussion. I think we can have a break now. So the break is for 20 minutes. We should end this session now. I think thanks a lot for the panelists that present very interesting topics, and thanks for the participation of other participants. So see you